We are under attack.
Where's your gun?
I don't have a gun.
What?
This isn't Detroit, Bill.
We are talking the festive horror comedy There's Something in the Barn, directed by Magnus Martins, who has primarily been a TV director to this point. So There's Something in the Barn is best described as a festive blend of Home Alone meets Gremlins with added violence. So the story focuses on an American family as they are moving to Norway because the dad has got a inheritance from an uncle, this kind of large property with a large barn, and you know, they're all kind of emigrating there ultimately, and they discover there's cultural differences between them and obviously the Norwegian people, but also there seems to be a kind of what is known as a barn elf living in the barn, and this barn elf initially kind of has a quasi-friendship with the kind of the young son, but they're warned, very much like Gremlins, that there's certain rules that you must follow, otherwise you will anger the kind of the barn elf and it would become a problem. And of course, being a dysfunctional American family, that's exactly what they do, and they not only kind of spark the ire of this one particular kind of barn elf, but he calls all his friends as well. And we have this big kind of like garden gnome siege at the end of the movie. So let's discuss. So this is ultimately kind of a killer garden gnome movie, really more than a kind of a, what I would say is traditionally thought of as an elf. Let's discuss what I think works in this film. So the production value is relatively high with this film. It kind of seems nice and polished. I believe it was actually filmed in kind of Norway and Finland. So it has that kind of that Nordic kind of feel to it. We see great kind of, you know, examples of the kind of the environment, the kind of the surrounding kind of area, this kind of snowy kind of backdrop, which gives it that kind of like that, certainly that kind of feel to it. So that's all kind of quite fun. The movie is, I wouldn't say it's like laugh out loud funny, but it's certainly amusing. At times there's kind of a lot of commentary and about obviously the cultural differences between Americans and these kind of like Norwegian people. There's a running gag about how Norwegian people don't have guns and how the Norwegians see the Americans as kind of like gun-toting idiots and things like that. So there's a few kind of like cultural kind of laughs here and there. The actual gnomes, really, or barn elves as they're kind of referred to in this movie, are actually quite well realised. They are, you know, their actors kind of in makeup and things like that made to kind of look small, a mix of kind of, I think, VFX and kind of little people and things like that. But they're quite well realised, and they do strike an interesting balance between being kind of friendly looking in some, when it wants the movie to be, you know, when the film wants us to kind of look at them in a kind of a positive light, but also kind of like ferocious as well. Very much kind of like you think like gnomes or kind of like the dwarves from Lord of the Rings, for example. So they kind of, you can look at them in two lights depending on how the kind of the movie kind of frames it for us. Which I think, I mean, they're not like Gremlins, like horror scary or anything like that. But you know, we see them kind of, they have like sharp kind of teeth and things like that. So they can look somewhat kind of ferocious and things. And our kind of our leader, the barn elf, is a slightly bigger one who's got a very kind of deep voice and stuff. So you know that they're an interesting kind of antagonist, and ultimately something you haven't really kind of seen before as a kind of a horror movie antagonist. Now the actual kind of plot, I guess you would say, is very reminiscent of many other kind of kind of horror movies. I've mentioned Home Alone and Gremlins, for example, but there are others as well. But yeah, it's the kind of the actual aesthetics of having these, what generally are kind of thought of as, you know, friendly kind of mythological folklore creatures being kind of like, you know, attacking people and things like that. And the movie does have some violent moments in it. I mean, this movie, I believe, was hyped to be ultra-violent. I wouldn't say it was ultra-violent. I wouldn't say it's necessarily especially gory, but it's more violent and more gory than the likes of kind of like Gremlins, you know, as a comparison. We do see some, you know, more adult-orientated kind of deaths and gore and stuff, but it's not like a gory splatterfest, to be honest with you. The cast are all kind of quite likeable. The father you would have seen in a few different kind of things. I suppose the Spider-Man films is kind of probably most notable. And you know, it's once we kind of get going with this kind of siege, this kind of like this attack from these kind of like elves, it pretty much is non-stop from that kind of point. And there are a couple of kind of, you know, fairly violent deaths, a couple of amusing moments, and generally speaking, a high production value. So what doesn't work in this film? I mean, it's very much like I say, it's a film that you've seen where the plot is very predictable. The basic storyline you have seen before if you've watched more than 10 films. So it isn't really anything new in regards to kind of plot outside of the kind of the aesthetics of these kind of antagonists being, you know, not something you've seen before, but the actual beats of the story, what happens, and the kind of like the inevitable kind of like resolution ultimately is pretty much what you're going to think. I don't think the movie is ever outstandingly funny or outstandingly kind of like scary. So it kind of hits that middle ground on both. It's kind of it's musing, but it's never kind of laugh out loud funny. And because of the aesthetics and the kind of the way this is kind of framed as a horror comedy, it never really has much in the way of genuine kind of horror or scares either, even though there are a couple of bloody deaths. I have to say, I think the movie would have benefited from introducing the kind of the main barn elf a little earlier and having the relationship built up with the son a little more, because it isn't long before he's kind of introduced, and then we have like the start of a kind of a friendship, and then it all goes wrong. And I think it would have been better had we kind of built that relationship just a little bit longer to kind of like before things kind of started going south. Because it barely seemed they had much contact before ultimately it all kind of goes wrong. So you never really feel like these two characters genuinely had much of a connection, to be honest. And it ends up being somewhat kind of pertinent towards the end of the movie. There's one or two jokes that even now have aged quite badly. There's a joke about Israel and Palestine. And obviously they weren't to know what was going to happen in November of 2023 when I'm recording this, but obviously that has already kind of aged quite badly. So we'll see if that joke actually ends up in the released version. I'm watching this as a screener, obviously, so we'll see if that ends up getting cut. Yeah, so it's kind of like, and I gotta be honest with you, I think the kind of the siege and the kind of like the horror elements, it just takes a little bit while, and it takes a little bit of time to get going. So how do we feel about this movie overall? I think this is a perfectly fine, you know, Christmas holiday movie. I don't think it's going to be remembered as fondly as, you know, Gremlins or Home Alone or things like that. But it's fine. I think it's, you know, it's, as I say, it's relatively well produced. There's a little bit of obvious green screen here and there, but, you know, it's relatively kind of like well put together on a production value. The cast are fine. There's some interpersonal kind of like relationship stuff, which I think was okay. And the antagonists are interesting. It's just not outstanding in any way. I'll give this one a 6 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to you next time.